They dragged her across the market like cargo, counted her as if she were a tool, and later, 3 years after they had sold her and torn her child away, she came back with a torch and the deliberate patience of someone who had learned how to keep an ember alive. The place was Minas Gerais, mid-1840s, hills folded like old cloth, a white house sitting higher than it should, and the plantation called Bela Vista, where the land owned the people who worked it. Isabel was not born that name. It was a name given, like so many others, at the moment of registry and sale. She had been taken from a village on the Congo coast, cradled at first by a sea that knew her language, then by a darkness that did not. The middle passage left its geometry on her body and on every body that survived it. Scars like maps, memories folded inward like a stone. At Bela Vista, days were measured by bells. At dawn, the bell called them out. They moved in lines through coffee rows, hands finding the soil by memory. The scent of wet leaves and roast beans followed them to the fields, and at night the Chenzala held the low chorus of voices, whispers that braided grief and rumor, lullabies that kept names alive. Tia Joanna told stories the way a person keeps a lamp, close to the chest, careful not to let the flame be seen by those who counted the colony's assets. Her stories were the family they had left behind, the river, the woman who walked with 2 moons, a song that named the stars. Manuel hummed when he worked. He could lift a sack of coffee beans and make the motion of it look gentle. Rosa, in the kitchen, moved like someone who had learned the house's invisible seams, what could be taken and what could not, where crumbs fell and where secrets hid. João kept horses and kept watch, a man who had once run and then returned, carrying the knowledge of paths that bent away from the plantation. Clara served the house, but kept a look in her eyes that saw both the dining table and the Chenzala that lay beyond the garden gate. And at the center of the property, in a house painted white as a promise, stood Coronel Domingos de Oliveira, owner, arbiter, and in a world of law that treated people as property, an embodiment of its cruel certainty. Daily life at Bela Vista had its small mercies and its humiliations. There were mornings of shared bread, fingers washed together at a wooden basin, laughter that erupted like sudden rain. There were afternoons of back-breaking labor, hands digging the earth into rows, palms rough as tree bark. There was also the architecture of visibility. The planters' walk beneath the chestnut trees, where certain faces were permitted to pass, and the shadowed corners where others were supposed to remain unseen. Isabel learned every seam of that architecture, how to bend her body not only to labor but to survival. But survival is not the same as absence of harm. The plantation owned more than labor. It acquired bodies and commanded them. The colonel's admittances were quiet and repeated. The precise words need not be said here to understand their consequences. Violence settled like dust, everywhere present, seldom named openly by those who otherwise called each other by the most tender names. Isabel carried the aftermath inward. It folded into hunger and sleeplessness, into the way she held her breath in the Chenzala at night, so the child in her belly might not be found by cruel eyes. When the child came, it was a small thing of fierce life, wrapped in scraps and song. A face Isabel would memorize like an anchor. Then one morning, the plantation yard filled with voices not meant for the Chenzala. A sale was announced. People who had been kin for years were called to stand as if they were goods. The auction was its own kind of violence, public, legal, ritualized. Men and women made to step forward beneath the hot sun, their names spoken and priced. Isabel held her son and felt the yard spin like a millstone. The child was taken from her at 6 months. He was sold to Señor Antonio Ribeiro at San Jose, taken into another house, another set of eyes that would rename him. The bargain was a small wallet of coins and a signature on paper. For Isabel, it was a wound that opened like a boundary. Something had been removed from her and could not be stitched back in. The sale became her hinge. Grief sharpens into a thing that can be used. It does not soften a person, rather it redirects the shape of what they are. In the years that followed, Isabel's life in São José was a geography of watchfulness. The new plantation had different rules and different guardians, but sorrow moves like water. It finds its way under every gate. She watched the roads home. She learned who rode past with letters, who carried bundles of blankets, how often the owner visited the markets. She noticed which servants walked with their heads low, and which deliberately lifted them so the house's patrons would not notice the way they exchanged nods in the market. 3 years is a long time to hold a hidden thing and pretend it is ordinary. It is long enough to grow a plan, from the size of a coal into something that could burn. Isabel did not speak of her idea in public. She spoke it in half words to Rosa, who listened with the practiced calm of a woman who had seen children taken before. She spoke it to João, who could move quietly and who knew the forest paths where embers could be hidden. She spoke to Manuel in the fields when the sun bent low and the others had left. He answered with a steadying hand on her shoulder and a single nod that counted as consent. The conspiracy was built of small acts: a stolen oil flask hidden beneath a bundle of straw, cloth rerouted and lain in the seam of a mattress, a lamp's wick snipped and replaced later with a longer one. They rehearsed nothing aloud. Their rehearsals were in the folds of everyday tasks, in fingers that learned to hold things the right way. Many details of these preparations are preserved in fragments: estate ledgers that note missing candles, a magistrate's record of a stolen oil jar, the memory of a neighbor who remembered seeing someone at night. Some of what follows is inspired by archival cases and oral testimony that survive in the region. The line between record and rumor is thin, and this is intentional. Where the archive is silent, memory speaks. Both deserve to be heard, albeit with care. They set a day. It would come in the season when rains were expected but not heavy, a night where the sky promised gloom and the road would be muddy enough to erase footprints. They chose the hour when the household's watch was thinnest. Between the second bell and the deep night's hush, the women gathered: Isabel, Rosa, and a few others whose names the plantation logs would never record. The men, João and Manuel, took posts at the edge of the forest, ready to light the path to escape. Clara, who moved inside the house with a servility learned as survival, became the ambiguous instrument who closed a window unseen or left a door less latched than usual. Her motives were private and complicated, perhaps compassion, perhaps calculation. She would always remain a figure between the house and the Cenzala, moving in both worlds and thus impossible to classify simply as traitor or savior. The night came with rain at first like a rumor. The bell chimed its hours, indifferent. Isabel put her hand on the charred marks of the child's cradle, spots where a small foot had once pressed into a thin blanket. She wrapped a length of cloth around her arm, knotted it with the same fingers that had once braided hair. She carried a slender torch, wrapped in cloth steeped in oil, hidden under a basket of laundry. Her face was calm as a surface of water that hides a current. She walked toward the house with friends at her back, with the memory of her son like a lantern that blinked and stayed lit inside her chest. They passed the slave quarters, and for a moment the Cenzala paused. Some of the men and women stood as if in prayer, as if to watch a ritual that had become inevitable. Others turned their eyes away, because to watch might be to put oneself at risk. Isabel had learned the fine metrics of courage on a plantation. To act was to hazard everything. To remain silent was to carry a different kind of death. Inside the manor, the rooms smelled of wax and fried food, of the linen that had never met the fields. A hush had settled on the servants who still moved there. Tonight, many were asleep, many gone to bed with stuffed stomachs and sleeping pills of resignation. The colonel's house slept like a giant that imagined itself invincible. The servants' door was unlocked, left ajar in a way that a knowing hand could widen. Clara pressed her palm to a shutter. She moved with the quiet of someone who had rehearsed the mundane 1,000 times, and in the mundane she found the place to speak truth. They went in slow, in pieces. Isabel carried her torch like a private sun. The first spark met the oilcloth and breathed. A quiet flame at first, then a hungry thing. Fire is not only destruction, it is a language. It makes claims. It eats the gloss of white paint and writes a smear that declares, "This house is not unbroken." It consumes curtains that once draped the colonel's table. It licks the stair that led to rooms where orders were given and favors were taken. It spread under the eaves with the speed of a rumor in a market. Within the house, people woke to smoke and to a chaos that was not part of their orderly world. The colonel ran into the night in slippers, his face a mask of insult and surprise. Men banged on doors and tried to drag out trunks and papers, trying to rescue the symbols of wealth: ledgers, court documents, the small metal boxes that kept promissory notes. But fire is indifferent to value. It eats both the quilt and the bond. It turned the colonel's world into ash and heat. Outside, the plantation's watch sounded the alarm. Dogs barked, men clapped lanterns and ran, some with pitchforks, some with the terrible recognition that a house burning was more than a property loss. It was a punctuation mark in a story long told. The flames rose like the chest of a seer proclaiming truth. In the fields, those who had not been part of the plot watched the sky, saw the orange, and felt the ground tremble under the sound of it. Isabel left the house as the fire grew, stepping carefully through smoke. She did not look back to see the colonel's face fall from being a man into being a human whose home was gone. The fire took objects and memories without asking permission. She walked into the night with Manuel at her side, João ahead on a path he knew by heart, and Rosa holding a child she had adopted in the improvisation of escape. The forest received them. The rain that had been a rumor began to fall in earnest, washing footprints into mud, erasing the geometries of movement. They moved like a tribe of secret things toward the only place that could hold them without questions. The Quilombo, the runaway settlement where fugitives wove new lives out of stolen breaths. Their escape was a corridor of small mercies, a traveler with a borrowed cloak who took them across a river at dawn, a farmer with a pardon mask who turned his head when he saw them pass. They reached the Quilombo in the days after the fire. There, names were restored like clothes given back to cold bodies. Isabel was seen as a woman who had redeemed herself from a silence that had been forced upon her. Others regarded her with ambivalence, because in a world that prized legal order, burning a house read as crime. After the flames cooled, questions followed. The legal record at the provincial courthouse registered the event as an act of arson. A few reports named no culprit, only smoke and loss. Family letters spoke in circumspect terms, asking for more soldiers and safety. Oral memory in the hills gave the same story with different cadences. Some said Isabel was captured and executed. Others swore she lived and became an elder, teaching children to tie rope and braid song. The archives hold ledgers and magistrate notes, a few inventories, and the occasional angry letter about lost goods. The archives do not speak to a woman's name with a verdict. They do what records do, record what property was lost, what fines were demanded, what livestock had perished. Here is the uneasy truth of historical memory. The legal papers reflect interests, oral histories preserve human feeling. Both are partial. Some of the details that place a woman named Isabel at the center of a plantation fire are drawn from estate reports and from court petitions that mention servants absent the night the house burned. Other elements come from stories told around kitchens and riversides where women bury truth in song and forget nothing. This narrative sits between those poles, inspired by archival fragments, informed by how people in that era spoke about resistance, and honest about what remains uncertain. The moral problem this night introduces refuses simplification. To those whose lives were extinguished or destabilized by the fire, servants who lost their food rations, house staff who lost shelter, neighbors whose livestock perished, the act was criminal, a wrong done against people who were not the colonel but still paid a price. To the enslaved, to those who watched their children taken to market and remembered the way the law allowed it, the burning was reprisal. It was an answer that the law did not provide. For Isabel, what had been destroyed was both a symbol and a ledger. The White House kept accounts of her life, deeds, receipts, the lines that marked who was owned and who was free. When the house burned, it was as if she had set alight the record-keeping itself. Did she intend to harm innocents? The very question reveals how complicated moral language becomes under oppression. A system that allows one person to be sold for a sack of coffee invites a range of responses, some of which will be cruel, and some of which will be desperate. Isabel's action, if it was her alone to choose, was shaped by years of degradation, by the hollowed chest dash that comes from having a child taken, and a conscience that refuses to be anesthetized. In the heat of that night, the distinction between criminal and freedom fighter felt brittle, both words strained under the weight of what had occurred. What happened afterward is ambiguous. Some witnesses claim soldiers arrived weeks later and captured fugitives. Some names were never found on the register of the executed. Other claimants insisted a pregnant woman had been seen at the Quilombo and then disappeared into the forest with a child. The truth feels deliberately oblique, as if the land itself conspired to keep memory malleable. Oral tradition, however, held firm about one thing. In those hills there persisted a story of a woman who returned 3 years after being sold and burnt a house that embodied the system that had taken her child. The story became an ember, carried from mouth to mouth, growing into legend. Legends obey different logics than court files. A legend is not a lie. It is a way a community makes meaning from what the law refuses to explain. In some villages, the story of Isabel is told as a cautionary tale about the cost of vengeance. In others, it is a hymn to courage. In certain family trees, the story is a contested inheritance. Some claim relation to a man sold at San Jose. Others say no such sale occurred. The archives, when consulted, are patient and dry. They preserve inventories, the kernel's silver, the number of cattle lost, a line that notes house burned. They rarely record the name of the woman who carried a torch and the name of the child who once smelled of milk. Yet, absence in an archive is not absence from history. We should be careful not to make Isabel into a single thing. She is at once mother, conspirator, survivor, sinner, and saint in various retellings. This doubling is deliberate. It is how people who have lived through brutality are often remembered, complex and contradictory. Her hand that once rocked a cradle was also the hand that struck a match. Her body that had been treated like an object carried within it a fierce subjectivity. She used the tools she had. Knowledge of schedules, the help of allies, a familiarity with the house's weak seams. She acted within a moral logic of returning a wrong with fire, a logic that, for those who consider the Colonel's world a lawful order, is monstrous. For those who have known the sequestration of family and body, it is a form of answer. 3 years after the sale, she returned. That date is not a small point. It is a deliberate cadence. It allows grief time to change shape. It allows for a plan that is not impulsive, but deliberate. It makes the act less of a blind rage and more a decision made like a surgeon selects an instrument. In the archive-inspired versions, the 3-year period is referenced in a neighbor's deposition and in the timing of when supplies went missing prior to a fire. In the oral accounts, that 3-year measure becomes part of the story's rhythm. 3 years to make sorrow into a plan. The Quilombo that sheltered them afterwards stood not merely as refuge, but as a living repudiation of the plantation economy. Within its bounds, people cultivated autonomy in small ways. A shared pot, a child who belonged to the village more than to a master, a naming ceremony that resurrected pre-capture identities. Whether Isabel lived to be an elder who told her own story, or whether she was claimed by violence remains unknown. The archive keeps a laconic silence. The memory keeps a warm glow. So how should we reckon with that night when a White House burned and a woman walked away? Is she a criminal? Is she a freedom fighter? The categories themselves are inadequate if applied in the flat certainties of an unharmed world. Under oppression, acts of resistance are often illegal by design. Law and justice diverge when the law itself protects an unjust order. It is possible to hold these contradictions at once, to see the destruction of property and its consequences, to see the moral reasoning that could make such destruction feel necessary, to honor the pain of the families who lost roofs and cattle, while also recognizing the immeasurable wrong of a system that treated a child like livestock. History, when told in the tones of the present, tends to demand judgments. But memory prefers questions. It asks us who we would be if our bodies had been turned into chattel, if our names had been trailed like commodity tags. It asks, what does justice require when justice is absent? It asks whether the loss a woman endured, made public in a yard where her child was sold, can be balanced by anything other than the law or a torch. In the years since, the ruins of Bela Vista changed hands as estates do. New owners painted over charred beams, wrote new ledgers, and tried to make the past into a ledger of transactions. The land kept its memory regardless. Children grew up with songs about the night the house burned, a tune taught by grandmothers who had been little girls and who could recite the names of those who had fled. County records list the fire in their margins, precisely noting what silverware was lost and how much livestock was reduced. Oral histories say Isabel's name with affection or with horror, depending on the teller. Both versions are part of the truth. We do not end on certainty. Isabel's fate remains by design ambiguous. Some descendants who come to the hills looking for documentation leave with an affidavit and an ache. Others bring back a syllable of her song and a braided rope from a quilombo, proof enough that memory can be material too. We are left instead with a question pressed to the chest. What do we do with stories like this? How do we remember a woman who was both wounded by a system and who answered with an act that toppled symbols of that system? If these hidden histories matter to you, subscribe. There are more stories the textbooks left out. The story of Isabel invites no tidy moral closure. It insists, however, that we might choose the stance of remembrance over the stance of forgetting. Remembering is not the same as celebrating every act that resistance produces. It is not a call to emulate violence in our own time, but remembering is a duty to recognize the structural conditions in which desperate acts occur. It is to see that the fire is a symptom as much as a deed. And so the final image returns us to the night and to the ember. A woman stands beneath rain, a torch in hand, a lullaby half sung. Behind her the white house reduces to skeleton and smoke. Ahead of her the forest receives footfalls and the possibility of a new life. In some tellings she dies shortly after, captured in the valley outside the settlement, condemned for having set fire to the property of another. In others she lives to be a teacher in the quilombo, calling children by names their ancestors spoke before capture. History keeps both possibilities alive, refusing to pin a definitive fate to a person whose life was in every way contested by others. Isabel's story does not ask us only to judge. It asks us to remember the circumstances that made such a night conceivable. It asks us to listen for the sound of a bell and to hear beneath it the small voices that were timed by that instrument. It asks us to decide how we will hold memory, as neutral record, as indictment, as mourning, or as something that binds us to the responsibility of making systems less cruel. Share this story and tell us, was Isabel a criminal or something else? Leave your thoughts below. Above all, let the ember she carried remain a question for us, not an instruction. Let it ask how we now attend to the ways societies name, own, and sometimes erase human dignity. Let us remember that the past persists in the sound of a bell at dawn, in the smell of coffee after the rain, and in the stories, both written and sung, that insist people were more than property.